everybody. Welcome to our series on the legacy of H.T Odum and systems ecology. I'm here with my colleague, friend, and co-host, Mark Brown from the University of Florida. We explore the history and future of systems ecology by talking with our guests about their journeys as researchers, practitioners, and advocates. Today, we're really excited to have a special guest, Dr. Walter Boynton. He's a distinguished emeritus professor at the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. He joined the faculty at their Chesapeake Bay lab in 1975, been there his entire career. He's an authority on systems ecology, estuarine ecology, ecosystem restoration, and the eutrophication of coastal ecosystems. He's been a prolific author in these fields with over 100 publications in scientific journals. Dr. Boynton has served on numerous boards and advisory panels, including the Patuxent Riverkeeper, the Nature Conservancy, and the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay. And among his many awards is the Odum Award for Lifetime Achievement given by the Coastal and Estuarine Research Federation. For many years, he taught a graduate ecology course on the ecosystems of Maryland that spanned from the western mountains in Garrett County to the Atlantic Ocean. So welcome, Walt. It's great to have you here, and looking forward to hearing all about your journey as a systems ecologist over the years. So
it's great to be here with you two. Yeah.
So it's kind of nice.
Way too many.
Yeah.
What's that, Mark?
I said it's been way too many years. We hung out together for quite a bit in the old days in Black Hall and the Center for Wetlands. So glad you're with us.
Yes, me too. Yes. Yeah.
I think it's kind of nice to start maybe kind of like a little bit of a time before you got to Chapel Hill, which maybe you interacted with Odum there, I think, and then you ended up at Florida with Dr. Odum. So I don't know if maybe you kind of go back to those years and tell us, what you were doing before all that and what attracted you.
Well, when I was a senior in college, I went to a little school in Western Massachusetts called Springfield College, and I did a degree in biology and chemistry there. And the final semester, I just needed sociology credits to graduate. And, I had campus life up to my gills. I was done. So this other guy and I wrote a proposal to the sociology department and said, look, for sociology credits, we will walk up the Appalachian Trail. We'll start in Georgia. We'll go as far as we can till graduation comes up. We'll show up. We'll do a public seminar at the school, show slides, and we'll write you letters describing this experience as we move from north to south with the spring. So that's exactly what we did. And before I did that, I applied to 5 graduate schools. And as we moved north, we wound up walking about 1,200 miles. And we got up almost to the Massachusetts border. And the idea wasn't to walk the whole trail, but it was to walk as much as we could. And that's just what we did. Oh, and also, we didn't do any of this fancy stuff with stashing food supplies or anything. We wanted to meet people. And so we would thumb into towns to, get some food and then go back up onto the trail and, walk for another week or 10 days or whatever. Anyway, as we're walking along, I got these notes when I would call home just to let the folks know, yeah, we're still alive. And they would say, well, you've been turned down by another school. Anyway, it turns out I got trashed at all 5 of them. And when we were getting close to the end, I'm actually getting to why I wound up where I am, sort of. I was talking to my dad, and we were in just about ready to cross the Hudson River in New York State. And I said, well, any news, Dad? And he goes, yeah, you got a letter here. And I said, well, what did it say? And he said, I didn't open it. I said, well, why not? He said, it's from the Solomon Islands. He said, I was there during the war. It was a horrible place. We were killing Japanese soldiers. They were killing us hand over fist. It was absolute miserable. You don't want to go there. And I said, Dad, Look at the whole address. And he goes, oh, Maryland, Solomon's Island, Maryland. And I said, yeah. I maybe they've given me a job. And he said, well, I don't think you want to go there either. And I said, well, for God's sakes, why? And he said, because that's the deep South. And, and my dad was such a Yankee that if you got to the southern boundary of Boston, anything south of there was the deep South. Anyway, sure enough, it was a job offer here. And so, I worked as a tech here, just doing, all the things, helping out in field work and cleaning glassware, just, a lab rat. And, but there were a couple of guys in the faculty here who thought H.T Odum was hot stuff. They really, really were inspired by his work. Silver Springs, for instance, the rainforest work. And this was in the 1969. It was in the earliest glimmerings that something was dreadfully going wrong in this giant estuary. And these guys had all grown up in a culture where you became an expert on tiny, tiny things, and you didn't tread on anybody else's turf ever. And so, this whole Odum thing of putting things together to develop a quote unquote a system was really, really exciting to these guys. So I'm sitting here with this degree from, Springfield College. My feet are still all bruised up from that walk. And I'm thinking I could never compete with these jokers. And basically I applied to the UNC where HT was to get them off my back. Not that I expected to get accepted. Anyway, amazingly, I did. And I got a letter back from HT himself saying, yeah, I'll take you on as a graduate student. I got some money to support you. We put you in for a fellowship and blah, blah, blah. And I thought, wow, this is incredible. And to tell you the truth, I was scared peeless. But I thought, well, I guess, you're gone this far, you may as well keep going. Anyway, a month or two later, I get another letter from HT, and he says, basically, oops, I'm off to Florida. I'm leaving. What I suggest you do is that you stay here and get a master's degree. And the reason for that is that you will have this wonderful fellowship. And one of his dear friends, a guy named Ed Kunstler, who did a lot of work on estuarine phosphorus, he said, Ed Kunstler has agreed to be your advisor. So why don't you, and since I'm just going to Florida, I probably wouldn't have any money to support you there, at least not initially. So get that degree done. If you're still interested, I will take you on. So I went to Chapel Hill. I took the required coursework. I left as soon as possible. And I actually wrote my master's thesis the first semester that I was sitting in Black Hall. Anyway, there's one other little nugget of a story here is that when these guys at CBL were telling me all about Odum, they said, you got to meet this guy. And I thought, oh boy, I wonder how we do that. And, I was so naive. I said, well, there is this limnology and oceanography meeting that a lot of people who do this kind of work go to, and you should go to it. And it's in Tallahassee, Florida. I think it was in the fall. So I drove to this ASLO meeting, and Odum was going to be there. He was going to give a talk or something, and the idea was to meet him and just I don't know, meet him. So I got there, and there is this giant redheaded guy. Okay, and it still reminds me of if the king of the beehive was a guy, that was the king, and there were all these worker bees fluttering around, and trying to get a word with him. And so, I'm in this throng of people, waiting my turn to have a word and say, hi, my name's Walter, and I'm hopefully going to be one of your students, and blah, blah, blah. And there is this big son of a bitch next to me. And he's really aggressive guy. And he's sort of nudging me out of the way, And I mean, and I'm at that time, I probably weighed 130 pounds soaking wet, and and I'm pushing back at this guy. Anyway, eventually we both get up there and start talking to Dr. Odum. And turns out this guy's Mike Kemp. And that's where I met Michael, was, fighting to get Odum's attention. And we both started at Gainesville about the same time. I finished a year or so ahead of Mike. And when I took the job up here, after being here for a year, I thought, man, this is lonely. I need some help. And so I literally just talked to the lab director and said, it's this guy Kemp, he's a smart guy. You need to hire him. And the lab director, I think we're talking 1976 now. The lab director said, really? I said, yeah, he's very bright. And he'll work hard. You won't regret it. And the lab director said, oh, okay, we'll give him a postdoc. Is that all right? I said, yeah. And Mike was hired. And Mike worked here until he passed away.
Yeah.
And it was, that was just for me and for Mike. It was just a wonderful collaboration. It always, over all those years when things were going wrong for him, I was there, and vice versa. And
Yeah, like
Mike could make the most complex sentences that I'm not sure anyone could ever unravel. And my job was to simplify them. And then when I'd simplify them, I said, is that what you mean, Michael? And he'd grudgingly say, yeah, I guess so. Yeah, why not use 200 words though?
Well, there's a lot packed in that story there. That's incredible. 1,200 miles on the Appalachian Trail.
Yeah.
I had never heard of anybody. So so you could just do that as part of a class to get course credit? This is like, how does that come to exist as an option?
I think nowadays, people are much more comfortable with some kind of experiential education. And, that was it was just a great trip. I mean, part of it was, there were times when we were moving through the Smokies where, the snow was 3 and 4 feet deep. And, we quickly learned we needed to get up way before it got light. So we could walk on top of this frozen snow, because when it started softening up, man, you were up to your hips. And,
Wow.
at night you'd take your pants and get them into a circle and hang them, because they would freeze brick hard by morning. And more than once, we had to dig a hole through the snowdrift so we could slide into a shelter and find a place, out of some howling storm. I mean, in some ways, we were lucky to stay alive. I mean, the weather was horrible.
Yeah.
But it was interesting.
I was going to say that this is long before there was such a thing as a cell phone and being able to figure out where we are in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, Mark, we would go for multiple days at a time and see nobody.
Yeah.
A few years ago, one of my sisters finished walking the whole thing, all 2,000 and some odd miles. And her experience was very good. But it was really different. The trail is so much better marked now. There are these rest sites and places where people actually have like little hostels, because there are so many hikers, they can actually make a living, with people coming in and getting laundry done. And, when we finished, I do know, I kept this diary. I weighed 155 pounds when we started. I weighed 130 when we finished. And there
Wow.
was no fat left on either of us. You know, we had these big leg muscles and everything else had atrophied.
Probably a
Anyway,
little bit longer hair too, right?
oh yeah. I mean, we looked, my mother looked at me and cried. It
How many months was the trip?
was about 90 days
90.
altogether.
Wow,
Wow.
good.
Yeah, March, April, and May.
So I think the other thing you were talking about too was the Solomon's Island and the Chesapeake Bay Lab. I guess there's a long history to the CBL being there.
Mm.
But who were these two guys that were so, or maybe there's more than two, they were
There
so
was,
excited about Odom? Like, who were they? Or like, what was their kind of background and
oh,
how they interacted with him?
well, one of them was a fellow named Joe Mahersky. And Joe was started working here in 1962. And he was really the first of the modern sort of quantitative ecologist. And he did his work with fisheries mainly. And one of the big issues in the Bay right then were the impacts of power plants on using estuarine water for cooling. And that's Joe was involved with that kind of research, trying to document impacts of electric power stations in coastal waters. And it was that was a really hot topic around here. A second guy was a fellow named David Flemmer, and he was an algologist, phytoplankton guy, and from Rutgers. He later became very involved with the Chesapeake Bay program. He went on to work for EPA. And the third one was a geologist. We called him a soft rock geologist. So it was more like unconsolidated sediments in coastal waters. His name was Bob Biggs. And he's still alive. He's very, very old. He went on and had a big career at the University of Delaware, helped them develop their marine program. And Dave Flemmer actually served on my master's committee because we had struck up a pretty nice relationship, really. And and Biggs was the one that just harassed me day and night about getting applying to UNC and trying to get a position with H.T Odum. And
Is he still here in Maryland, or does he move?
He lives, Biggs lives in Delaware.
Oh, Delaware. So close by. He might be
Yes.
interesting. So he must be, is he like in his,
Oh, I think
might be
early
his
90s.
Let's
Yeah.
say. Have you kept in touch with him at all, or is it kind of difficult?
Not lately, I haven't, for no good reason. I just haven't. And
I'm just being selfishly curious about, people that knew Odom before some of the students. And well, of course, a lot of people are not around anymore going back that early, but he might be somebody that.
yeah. Well, after I came up here, I think it was really early days, maybe 76 or so. We invited HT up to CBL and for a couple days. And he did come up. He stayed at Mahersky's house, which sat on a cliff overlooking the bay. And the whole community was just absolutely taken with this giant redhead ball of energy, and yeah, I mean, Mark, you remember the days where the rascal would come in with a giant pile of transparencies and start, this, transparency show. Anyway, he did that here. I mean, he couldn't help himself. And, people loved it. It was like, that was amazing, So it was very inspiring.
Yes, I think that
You
was a
arrive,
trick.
so you arrive in Gainesville. You haven't really had much time to interact with this giant redheaded.
Yeah,
And
right.
so what's your first impressions? What happens when you get here? Of course, you're writing your thesis, but other than that.
Well, he and I had a couple of. All right, there was this interesting. Now that I'm thinking about it, HT knew I had taken some classes with people that he knew at UNC. So I had taken some chemistry, basically, just flat out hardcore quantitative, um, uh, uh,
Just physical chemistry.
no, it's more like chemical chemistry. I'm trying to remember the Sturm and Morgan, that kind of
Okay.
aquatic chemistry.
Okay.
He knew I had done that. He knew that I had a degree with Ed Kunstler, and he liked Kunstler. And so I had this a little bit of an edge in that um, I he knew that I had taken classes, I had done some field work. Um, I knew something about estuarine ecology, not a great deal, but some. And I think HT was also at the stage where, his horizons were just really, really expanding. I mean, energy quality had just sort of burst on the scene.
Yeah.
So he had an enormous number of diverse students. And I think I was like a peg in the past. That he knew, well, if someone says, what's the formula for nitrate? I could tell them,
Okay.
and so there was some grounding. And I think that's where he and I started, and that helped.
Mhm.
So I don't think he was, quote unquote, wondering a lot about me. Anyway, so one of the first things we talked about, Mark, was whether we ought to try to find money for me to come back up here and do some kind of systems study of Chesapeake Island, which is a national seashore, and the associated bays and the mainland. So, and we talked a bunch about that. We drew some models about what the issues might be. Uh, he was attracted to the idea that the Park Service was in a very intense design phase. And one extreme of the design was to build high-rise hotels on this barrier island. In other words, make it a resort.
Yeah.
And the other was do almost nothing because the island is so dynamic and blah, blah, blah. So those were the extreme positions. And so HT thought, wow, this would be a really cool evaluation. Anyway, we thought about that. And then money for some work in Apalachicola Bay,
Mhm.
Sea Grant supported, popped up. And he said very clearly, if you want me to be your advisor, you're going to Apalachicola. And I said, okay, boss. And Apalachicola it was. And that was a great experience.
Right.
In fact, at one point, and again, one of the things that I really valued from that education was, a lot of what he was talking about, what we were thinking about and trying to understand was basically a theory of how the hell the world organizes itself. So that was pretty exciting. The thing that made it, I think, extremely interesting was that there was application of that stuff. And that really appealed to me. I thought, wow, this is cool science, this is new stuff, and we're using it. So, I think the bottom line of my dissertation was that the pulsing nature of these systems really helps certain communities have some pretty spectacular rates of net production.
Right.
If I was to say what was the one thing that was important, and sounds pretty simple now, but we certainly struggled with trying to show that with empirical data and with to get these models to capture that kind of dynamic.
Yeah.
And so eventually, that I think that worked out pretty well. But one of the parts that the applied part of this that was so cool was that we needed to make a presentation to the Franklin County Board of County Commissions. And so the way we decided, and Sea Grant had a liaison guy working with me. And, I later learned that if you had a 5'10" skinny hippie running around Apalachicola back in them days, that was not a smart thing to be doing. You needed to have someone, a local, say, yeah, I know he's weird, but he's okay. He's with me. Anyway, that's what George was all about. Anyway, they, um, I told him, I said, well, we're required to make a presentation to the commissioners. And he said, fine, why don't we go up there and talk to them? So George and I went up there and we chatted with the commissioners and set a date and all this sort of stuff. And what I told them was that we were going to show them some models of, and that they would be instructive and blah, blah, blah. And the commissioners were really very excited about that. And so, I went back and told Dr. Odum all about it. We got all this blah, worked up and so forth. And when we get up there, George comes and grabs me and pulls me aside and says, we might have a problem here. And I said, well, what's the problem? Dr. Odum's here. We got all these slides, this is going to be a great talk. And he says, yeah. I said, but when you were up here, you were talking about models. These three guys think you're talking about good looking women, models. So you have a problem. Yeah. Anyway.
Oh, no.
So I thought, what the hell am I going to do? So I hustled over to Dr. Odum and said, man, listen, we've got this little issue here, and we're going to have to dance around it or something. Anyway, to me, much to his credit, he found that hilarious. And and so we just soldiered on, and he made a bunch of really interesting points that they could really get their teeth into. The whole business about the river coming up and going down, the salt going up and down, the dangers of diverting all of that river flow into the Georgia, Atlanta suburbs and so forth and so on. Anyway, that was pretty cool. It was
Still a major issue, they're still fighting over that.
I know. Well, after, unfortunately, Scott Nixon isn't with us anymore, but after I was long gone, Scott got involved with the water controversies in Apalachicola Bay.
Oh, I didn't know.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So did you work at all on the Crystal River, or were you just a field?
I was the Crystal River crew was Wade Smith,
yeah,
and Mike Kemp, and
maybe we should give a little background. When we say Crystal River, people out there have no idea what we're talking.
Go ahead.
So Odum got a grant or money from the Florida Power Corporation. I think it was Florida Power, to study the effects of the hot water coming from the power plant on the estuarine system. And so that then was a project. It went on for years, it was 5 years, wasn't it?
I think something like that, Mark. Probably at least 5 years.
Yeah. So go ahead.
Anyway, God, I think there was a fellow named Mel. I can't get his last name.
Mel Lehman?
Mel Lehman. Yes, he was from Montana.
Yeah.
He was involved, and there may have been a couple other guys as well. And they were trying to do, sort of an Odum-esque system level evaluation, which, in a way, and I'll say a little more about this later. It meant measuring at least some of almost everything, because we knew we were going to put together some models. Anyway, I was a helper. I hung out with Mike a lot, and they did a remarkable job, I think, of pulling together some really diverse and in some ways difficult things.
Mhm.
They measured a lot of metabolism. They could really look at temperature effects on N to P ratios and net production at elevated temperature. And I mean, it was quite the study. In fact, when they were building the nuke, the
nuclear power plant.
Yes. The Crystal River crew they were thinking about having a holiday and having Thanksgiving. And HT, had one of his little burps, and he was having none of this rest time by these miserable, useless graduate students, and told them, get their lazy behinds down there and make a bunch of measurements while they weren't in class. So off you go, boys. And so they all scurried off, to Crystal River. That was probably on maybe a Tuesday or something like that. Anyway, my wife Mary Ellen heard about it. She was a physical therapist, and she was doing her last internship over at the VA hospital. And so Mary Ellen said, well, all these poor guys are going to be down at that power plant for Thanksgiving. What are they going to be doing? Eating peanut butter sandwiches? And I said, well, probably, if they're lucky, maybe peanut butter and jelly. And so Mary Ellen says, I'm making them Thanksgiving dinner. So she cooked up this giant turkey with gravy and whipped potatoes and squash and God knows what else. And the idea was we'd throw it all in the back of this junk car that we had. And she wound up with this Vietnam vet that she was treating. And this guy, Gary, I mean, he had been shot up. I mean, there wasn't much left of him. But he was rehabbing. I mean, he was moving in a good direction. So Mary Ellen stuffed him in the car. So we've got this vet that's all bandaged up. I mean, he looked like Frankenstein. We've got a turkey dinner. Mary Ellen and I, we drive to a place where they're building a nuclear power plant. And we drive up to the guard place, and the guard says, well, what's going on? And we said, well, we got dinner here for the guys doing the environmental work. And the guard says, oh, that's great. What about this guy with bandages? Mary Ellen says, he's one of my patients. Don't worry about it. The guy says, great, have a good dinner. Go on in. Anyway, when I go to airports now or anything else, and I think of, all of the security, and then, I think of Crystal River.
Yeah.
And in some ways, what an interesting world it was then.
Yeah.
So anyway, the guys, Mike finished up and his dissertation and Wade's dissertation, they were all focused on the Crystal River work.
Right. Yeah.
Go ahead,
recall
Mark.
Different blue crab boils when they would come back from sampling down there and bring all these blue crab back.
Yeah.
Blue crab boil.
Yeah. Right. I remember we had this one scandal where the Crystal River crew, they worked really hard, and the conditions were often pretty tough. Having done field work for the rest of my life, I would rank some of that up there as some of the more challenging pieces of work. Anyway, they went down with Black Hall, I don't know, maybe an 18-foot center console on a trailer. Yeah. And they were trying to get it in the water. The tide was low. The ramp itself was covered with algal slime, and they started backing down the ramp, and the trailer and the van just kept going, glug, glug, glug. Okay. And so the word got back to Black Hall that, there were a bunch of these malcontent graduate students, ripping drunk, driving equipment, into the ocean. And there was a few tense days over that, but it all got resolved and the boys did good. So that was part of the show. So we also, I remember coming into multiple times, coming into that room in Black Hall on the first floor where a bunch of us had desks, and we would come in and find Dr. Odum sound asleep at the Miniacs. And it was, and it always embarrassed him because, he would wake up and he would say, well, just taking a nap. He'd actually been there all night fooling with something. And it'd be all these, he just had such a lovely way of drawing these little mini models.
Yeah.
Just the way he drew them was captivating, really. Anyway, that
I was thinking it's kind of getting close to my questions. Like, what was the models like at this point? This is the early 70s, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, we know kind of his language and the energy systems language, but like the hardware, what was that looking like, and how are you guys interacting with it and developing it and running it?
Yeah, I think shortly after I left, I think there was a move away from the analogs to friendlier ways of doing that without the giant decks of punch cards. Anyway, the biggest model I had, which I think was the biggest one that we had at that time, had 18 state variables. And the way, and we ran it on what they called slaved AD80 analog computers, which were not in Black Hole, but up in electrical engineering. And the only way I could get to, and I needed to use those because if you wired two of these, you needed strong people to lift the patch,
Yeah.
what do you call where
The
you
board-
plug all the wires in,
The boards, I don't know.
the boards, yeah. Anyway, there were two of these and they were all cross-wired. So I used to get the janitors up there, they got to know me, and I could work on that model from around 10 o'clock at night until 8 o'clock the next morning. And that's when they weren't using it. They were happy to have it, HT students using it. So I think that was about shortly after that, Dave, I think the technology improved and analog computing went away. When I got up here, analogs were not in the game. Although I have to admit, HT and I had some great evenings playing with that Apalachicola model because, I mean, you could just take, and we had a bunch of oscilloscopes, so you could watch lots of state variables. And I mean, it was like the being on the Starship Enterprise. I mean, we were blinking lights everywhere, and he was captivated by turning the potentiometers, and basically he would just bark at me, "What's this one?" I said, "Well, that's primary productivity." Ooh. Anyway,
Well,
and it was just very, very stimulating. And some of the really, I think, really world-class water quality models, like Dominic DeToro, for example, their attitude on models was much like HT's. Curious about what the forecast was, but even more interested in what the hell is this teaching me, and what's missing. And DeToro always used to say, "Well, I hope this model doesn't work." And I used to say, "Why, Dominic?" He said, "Well, first off, I love being right. And so by saying, I hope it doesn't work, I'm pretty sure I'm going to be right." But the other thing is that figuring that out is what really moves us ahead.
Yeah.
And, I think that's one of the things I learned in, room 213. Yeah, was, doing those little Miniac models. I think they were really instructive.
Yeah.
In the course we taught here for many, many years, we, students had to do a project. So it was a 4-credit course, and it involved 3 field trips, 2 lectures a week, and they had a paper to write. And the paper had to involve the interactions between systems. So you couldn't write a paper about phytoplankton productivity, no way. But you could write a paper about the uplands interacting with a stream, the atmosphere interacting with the ocean. So those kind of things. And, we taught that course, I think, for up until I retired, 15 years, I guess.
Wow.
And it was really interesting to see how different students were wired. Some of them would hear about that requirement of the course, and all you could see was some dust as they hit the road. They had no interest in that, mainly because it was just so frightening. And other students thought, this is a hot setup, man. And they loved it. And would start drawing conceptual models. Um, and we worked really hard to get them used to the idea that drawing a conceptual model again and again and again is the way you really learn something about them. You know, it's not one and done. That's not going to work.
Right.
So that was another thing that actually with Mike Kemp, when we were in Gainesville, we really were drawing basically for both his work and mine, you know, the same model, but refined, and then refined again and again and again. And you
Yeah.
know, that was really worthwhile.
So it sounds like that's an element of your learning from Dr. Odum. That's really something you carried through
Oh
in a
yeah,
lot of ways through
yes,
your
for
work,
sure. Yeah, yeah.
both conceptually and doing and mathematically modeling. I'm guessing too, right?
Yeah, you know, once I got here, I never did a lot of, well, as the lead person anyway, mathematical modeling. Um, I was I was associated with it, um, but not as the lead. I got really involved with partly because the opportunities were there, and I think partly because I just really liked it. Doing some pretty innovative field work. So when the Chesapeake Bay program got underway, you know, they have this massive monitoring program, which it was really clear that they needed it badly.
Mm.
Um, and and normally monitoring programs you involve measuring concentrations. You know, so you measure nutrient concentrations. Well, from the Odum perspective, you know, and drawing these models all the time, you know, my head sees all of these pathways, these rates. And
Right.
so both Kemp and I were arguing really hard that we needed to be clever enough to have lots of rate measurements in the monitoring program. And one of the things that eventually sold it was the argument that without those many rate processes, so this is like nutrients coming out of the sediments of the bottom, oxygen being consumed, primary production, water column respiration, you know, nothing magic, just important rates. And so the argument we made was that without having these rate measurements, the water quality modelers were literally free to turn the potentiometers all over the
Yeah.
place to get calibration or verification. So they needed to be grounded. And you know, it was these rates that were the underlying reasons we measured the concentrations we do measure. So and EPA and those people bought it,
Yeah.
which was shocking. I mean,
That's
I
the,
can remember being stunned.
that's the
And
incredible thing by Odum's approach. I mean, he was a modeler, and in modeling, you not only have state variables, but you've got to have the coefficients on the rates of things moving around, you know. And up until that, people were just measuring the state variables and what they are. Yeah.
so
Wow.
that was really I think, a big breakthrough in our monitoring effort up here. And to a certain extent, Mark, that's, um, you know, in the early days, if we could measure the consumption of oxygen by these estuarine sediments, I mean, that was an attaboy. You know, and then we got a little better at it. We could measure some forms of nitrogen and phosphorus. And nowadays, you know, the next generation of people, they're measuring nitrogen fixation, denitrification, nitrification, you know, inorganic carbon flux and all. I mean, it's sort of like I'm saying, whoa, huh.
Yeah.
I'm glad I'm an oldster. I wouldn't want to have to compete with these little tigers. So
It's funny
anyway,
because being in Maryland all these years, I always hear about the Bay model. I've never seen it or looked at it, but it's kind of interesting to hear that there's Odum DNA in the Bay model. It sounds
oh
like
yeah,
is that
yeah, there is.
for sure.
And you know, I think one of the most, how should I put this? Well, you guys would understand this, um, is that the model is highly non-linear. The state variables interact. Okay, so this is a complicated model.
Mm.
And so I think that is, you can track that right back to HT. You know, the times where we would have those big arguments with Bernie Patton over whether, linear models, the attractiveness being that there are these analytical solutions. You can look for stability before you run the model, lots of things. And HT's point of view that real world, to get anything resembling the real world or characterizing the real world is, it's interactive. So it's got to be nonlinear. And I think a lot of us, discovered ways to stabilize those models so that they, did not go bozo.
Yes.
And with the Bay model now, they figured all that out. And so, anyway, initially, you'll like this. The first Bay model had nine spatial chunks. So, there was this chunk above the Bay Bridge in Annapolis, and then there were 4 chunks to the ocean, and each chunk had a top and a bottom. And Mike Kemp ran a model, water quality model, with that kind of spatial resolution. And that was probably in the early, like maybe 1980. And we were all really pretty proud of that. Anyway, right now, the number of unit chunks in the model sits at around 58,000. Yeah. And
It's a lot of rates.
yeah, it is. And anyway, and the reason is they discovered why they had to do that as they moved along. And one of the biggest reasons, probably the biggest reason, is that this bay has this complicated doggone topography. And that topography pushes the water up and down and back and around. And, you can't resolve that if you got these giant chunks. And so they kept chopping it up until they get better and better physics, really. And that's where they're at now. And that generation of modelers who got it to that point, they've just retired. And so there's a new group that are pushing this model forward. And the oldsters, many of whom Mike and I worked with, from our point of view of doing the field stuff and doing field experiments, we were constantly asking, okay, this is what we've seen. Can the model do that?
Yeah.
That was the sort of interesting, way of interacting. And they oftentimes would say, and you guys can't measure that. And would say, no, you're right. You have to use the model to get that because you can't measure that. Anyway.
So it sounds like you had some interesting maybe interactions you had Dr. Odum visit CBL when you got up here, but what about the rest of your time in Maryland? Did you get opportunity to interact with him some more, or?
Largely not, at least not directly, Dave. And we saw him at some meetings. I think in one way he was a little disappointed in us in that we were not well, he was very involved with this, I'm not even sure how to talk about it, energy quality, energetic evaluations.
Right.
And Mike and I, anyway, I think, but then he would also quickly say, but you guys are doing all this good ecology stuff, and humans are involved. So I guess that meant, so we're okay. But
I mean, it's funny because, I had the opportunity when I graduated from Florida in 1999, and I went and took a job in South Texas in Kingsville, which is near Port Aransas, which is where the UT Marine Station was. It just happened that a person that he had hired in 1958 when he was the director was retiring in 99, and he came there the same week that I was starting. And I got to see him kind of interact with these guys from this is like 40 years ago or something for him. It was just incredible. Like he had never left, they, they all came out wearing these Hawaiian shirts. That was their thing.
And do you remember who the guys were?
It's been 20 years. I can't remember their names at all.
Was Pat Parker, one of them?
I think that sounds familiar.
Yeah.
I mean, but he may have stayed at his house. It seems like he was staying at
Wow.
somebody's house.
Wow.
Um,
But maybe B.J. Copeland?
BJ Copeland, I knew from being at NC State because that's where
Okay.
I had, I just knew him by name. But
Yeah.
yeah, I was wondering, kind of like that early period in his life when he was really doing the coastal stuff really heavily. That's in the 50s, and it's it's nice that you guys were able to continue that, and so many of you too. I think really, with Kent and Nixon um,
Yeah. And
and the
Court
Federation.
Stevenson.
Yeah, um, that's great. So, so what
Yeah.
else? So I think been in a position where you've taught and interacted with a lot of students, and I think we're always curious about what the students take on. You already mentioned this a little bit, on the modeling and the systems ecology perspective, and some people some of them are really attracted to it. I don't know what your experience has been with that.
Well, um, some were and some weren't. One of the things that some faculty here criticized the course that we taught, which was very Odum-like, was that they would say it's too superficial, too superficial. And I used to tell the students that we were going to cover a lot of ground. We were going from the mountains to the sea. We were going to look at commonalities of process across this very substantial landscape. And I told them that there were no rules whatsoever about becoming really, really expert in one or more of those places. So don't let this superficial business, run your show, because it's largely nonsense. So anyway, so some of the students really liked that. What was rare is to have someone that's got that broad perspective and was attracted to having really quantitative skills. So, finding someone that, could look at the land-sea interface in its complexity and not be blown away, have some ability to say, okay, these are the really, really important pieces that I'm going to be concerned with, and this is the way I'm going to put it together quantitatively. So that gets rare. So some of the folks that really like this big picture business were not so good and were really challenged by the quantification bit. And they often slid over into working with the management agencies. And thank goodness they had that broad view. That was useful. So, we've had, both Kemp and I have had students that later became our bosses. That was interesting because they went to work for EPA or state government, and we would go in to have contract negotiation sessions. And anyway, and they turned out to be pretty savvy.
That's a good track record to have, getting good students in and seeing them through and getting them into good positions.
Yeah, I thought so. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
If you had to describe the education you got and what systems ecology is in layman's terms, I mean, what does it mean to wind up being trained the way you were trained and the way it obviously was that you trained your students?
Yeah. Well, I think it has to do with a worldview. I just don't see individual pieces. So I would be a horrible taxonomist. I mean, really bad. What I see is connection. And
Right.
so I think that is one ingredient of this systems ecology education. The other one is scale and the relationship among scales. I think H.T was a genius at talking about and drawing diagrams of scales. You know, I had this wonderful friend who was a songwriter and artist, and the world's worst businessman, because he was constantly broke and he used to live at our house because otherwise he'd be on the street. Anyway, he took and did a drawing for me, not an original, it's a copy, but he put his own twist on it, of this giant. And the giant is sitting there with his hand out. And in his hand is the giant. And in that giant's hand is the giant, and so forth, you know. Trying to understand what scale we're dealing with and picking the right one is pretty important. You know, I think one of the things that H.T., when we were working on Apalachicola, one of his comments that I thought was really important was when we're drawing boundaries, was to make sure that you didn't have, that you had all the important interactions within, and that you weren't trying to stretch feedbacks outside of the system that you're trying to understand all these interactions with. So I think with Mike and I, that stayed with us for a long time, was just trying to understand a little bit better where the boundaries are, where the appropriate ones were, where, you know, the ones that made sense.
I can't tell you how many times I heard, if you want to understand something, you've always got to look at the next larger system that it's embedded.
Yeah,
And
that's better said, Mark. That's what I was trying to say. Yes.
I mean, he just pounded on that.
Yeah.
And had to look at three scales. You had to look at the thing you're looking at, the next larger scale, and the lower scale that system was affecting. And he was always, you know, yeah.
Yeah, I think those are all really important systems ecology lessons.
Do you think that education today has a systems component? Do you see it anywhere?
I see it here.
Mm-hmm.
I see some of it at VIMS down the bay from us. I don't think it's as strong as it was.
Yeah.
You know, we have a couple of people who did degrees with people who did degrees with HT, and
Grandchildren.
yeah, and they're teaching, and that system sense is firmly entrenched in what they're teaching.
Yeah.
So, you know, around here, meaning, you know, our campus of the University of Maryland, I think it's doing okay.
Mm-hmm.
You know, before he died, Mike Kemp was really, really concerned about it. You know, just really deeply worried that it was going away.
Yeah.
And for most of my career, I did not teach. You know, when I came here in '75, for the first 20 years or so, I may have taught, you know, 2 seminars.
Mm-hmm.
The reason being was that the education program was pretty flimsy and not very well developed. And I came here because this was a research institution.
Right.
And I mean, hell, this place had labs and mesocosms and microcosms and boats. You know, I thought, hell, I'm not teaching, man. I'm going out in the boats, you know, and float around and, you know, see what weird stuff we can measure.
Right.
And so, and later, you know, when things really formalized with the education program, much more so, and one didn't need to be affiliated with one of the big departments up at College Park. I became more involved with education, but never to the level of, you know, being able to say, you know, on the East Coast, here are the 8 institutions that are answering your question, Mark. I just never got there.
You mentioned grandchildren, and I'll tell a real quick little story. You know, at some point, I got a phone call from this guy, Richard Murphy, who worked for the Cousteau Society. And he said he wanted to know if we would like to go on with them to make these movies on you know, a whole set of movies called Rediscovery of the World. And I said, yeah, but how in the world did you come up with us? You know, how did that happen? And he said, well, I'm PhD student of a guy named Jim Kramer. And I said, and he says, and Jim Kramer was a PhD student of Scott Nixon's, and Scott Nixon was a PhD student of H.T. Odum.
Yeah.
And there was enough of Odum that went from him to Nixon to Kramer to Murphy that when they wanted to find somebody to do big scale science, that was the obvious choice to make. I've always thought that was just a fascinating, you know, and Kramer was out in Southern California when.
Yeah. You know, one of the grad students I did have, a woman named Kim Makita, she went with Jim to do some system level evaluations of the rice culture in Bali. And they put together an Odum-like model of this.
Right.
And they apparently struck up quite the relationship with the priest,
Yeah.
whose one of his main jobs was to decide where and when the water would move to various parts of the rice.
Yeah.
And Kim said that they, in this one meeting, they were literally walking this priest through this model. And this priest sort of very calmly and very gently looked at them and said, "That's what I do."
Yeah.
Yeah, anyway. So, I
Well-
mean, that was another HT thing that went up through multiple generations.
To bring that full circle, Jim came to the University of Florida for 3 days, and I explained emergy and modeling and everything else to him. And I guess that's then how he wound up with your former student. It was
Wow.
interesting.
Yeah.
Full
So,
circle.
you know, one of the other things I should mention that I think both Mike and I, but maybe more me, was that I took away from HT. And and it might have been more from his writing than from his teaching and direct interaction. And that is the power of comparative ecology. So, you know, one of the things where I really got that was that, you know, he went on that sort of binge of measuring metabolism in springs. You know, there was never a spring that he didn't see and like.
Right.
And, you know, Mike and I wrote a paper about, you know, what does the Silver Springs study tell us? What did we learn from that? You know, and I mean, I think, well, Mike and I thought we learned a ton.
Oh, yeah.
That it absolutely had effects that are still reverberating, you know, through our science, and most people don't even know it. Anyway, one of the things that I thought he did a great job on was this business about comparing ecosystems. So part of it is it's a space for time substitution where, you know, you could look at an enriched spring and one that isn't and see how the metabolism is different. And that might get you some answers much faster than taking that nutrient poor system and fertilizing it for a couple decades to get it to be enriched. So comparison was really, really important. And in the late 70s, there was some, I mean, huge arguments in these coastal areas. I mean, we went through federal court on this, was whether in some of these estuarine areas, they ought to be controlling phosphorus or nitrogen or both. And when Mike and I showed up here, the phosphorus crowd was in absolute control. That even thinking about nitrogen removal was the, epitome of stupidity. And so one of the things that we did was to start gathering published papers and some reports that had information on algal biomass, primary production, and nutrient concentrations. And some of them had estimates of nitrogen and phosphorus loading. And I think altogether, we managed to get a pretty complete data set for maybe 30, 35 different estuaries. It was a hell of it was a lot of work. Anyway, it was one of the first ecosystem papers that said the case for nitrogen influences on these systems is overwhelming.
Yeah.
You have got to think about nitrogen, and you probably need to think about phosphorus too. But if you don't consider the nitrogen issue, you are not going to get the result you're hoping for. Anyway, with that, some of these rural counties in southern Maryland had a political leader who we worked with a lot. He would come down, he was a state senator. He would come down and say, teach me some ecology. We would talk with him a lot, and then go up and talk to the governor of Maryland and the state senators. And he had that political in. And he used to say, Walter, you're coming with me. So if you're with me, these guys won't dare bullshit me. So it was nice ground level, I sort of liked it. I thought, wow, yeah, this is good, let's get in here and do some, yakking and fighting. Anyway, eventually the state of Maryland came up with a water quality plan for some of these estuaries that only had phosphorus in it. And the southern Maryland, these rural counties, basically tobacco people, sued the more sophisticated upper counties and EPA. And it went to federal court, and Judge John Sirica heard the case. He was the guy that was the judge in the Nixon White House tapes. Anyway, he heard our case. Anyway, we won. Yeah. Anyway, and Odum's comparative ecology stuff was a really important deal there. And I'll tell you, another part of it was when I could show, or we, the collective, we could show these political people, it's not just this example. This happens all over the place. This is general. Then their confidence level, you could see it pop up. It wasn't that, some wacko academic is showing me some piece of off the wall information. Should I believe it? Well, who knows? But when they see 35 places that make sense, pointing in one direction, that's a much more powerful message. And that's another HT bit. I wish I could say I invented that, but I didn't. Not even close. So one of the things you guys said was, if I had a chance to ask HT a question now, I could haul him back. I would say, I want to sit here for a couple of days, and I want you to explain to me, answer my questions about energy quality. I'd really like to learn more about that. There's this sneaking feeling that it's right, that there's a whole lot to it. And Mark, when the last thing I did on my dissertation was to make an estimate of hydroelectric, how does that relate to, I guess it was oil, and or
the electricity.
Anyway, we used the dams on the Apalachicola River, and made some calculations about that. And at the time, I think that was kind of the earliest version of what do you call it, energy quality. And it's been, I think, from the little bit I've seen, sophisticated a whole lot beyond that. But it was interesting.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I get up that way every once in a while, Walter, and I'll give you a call and
Yeah,
I'll say
do that.
a day or two and we'll talk energy quality if you want.
Yeah, I would like to know more about that.
Right. Okay.
One of the things that used to bother me was that it seemed like there was more ways, many pathways to do something, and
Yeah.
how to decide which one was the one you were going to use was very
Yeah.
blurry to me.
Yeah.
Anyway, um,
Well,
I
that's
thought that was interesting stuff.
one of the most misunderstood of all of the stuff that HT has done over his lifetime. That's probably one of the most misunderstood concepts, the concept of energy quality.
Yeah. You know, Elliot Campbell
Yeah.
um, has worked at Maryland DNR for a great long time.
Right.
And his dad, Dan,
Sure.
right?
He's on the list.
Oh, good.
Dude, for
All
sure.
right. Yeah. Anyway, Elliot took our systems ecology course here. And,
Okay.
many years ago when he was working on a degree. And he was one of the really great, thoughtful guys.
Yeah.
Uh,
Came and
anyway,
got a degree with me. And then he went up and got a PhD with David.
Yeah,
yeah,
that's why he was here. Yeah.
anyway, we
He's
were,
like a direct lineage, he's technically the step grandson of HT, through
uh,
Dan being married to, how's it?
oh,
He's married to
Betty's daughter. Yeah.
Betty's daughter. So not
huh.
blood, but about as close as you can get.
Oh, that is great, you guys. Huh. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Mark, are you going to have another wetland event sometime?
You want me to?
Well, yeah, yeah, if
I'll, I'll
you
tell
can
you another
convince
one that
people
you
like Jim Zucchetto to
one
come
that
down.
you might consider coming to rather than a wetlands thing is that we have an energy conference. That's the energy quality stuff here every 2 years. And the next one will be in January of 2025, which is a year from now.
Yeah, let me write that down.
That you get an invite.
Yeah.
And it brings together a lot of current people, but a lot of the old hat hands. And I would love if a bunch of HT's former students came, whether they wanted to listen to the lectures about energy or not. We throw a heck of a dinner on the Thursday night, I think. And then there's a big party at my house on the Saturday, and that gets everybody together. So
You know,
I'll make sure you get an invite.
yeah, please. Yeah, I
It's an
think
interesting it's an interesting crowd. There's a very international group of people that have really dived a lot very deeply into energy quality and energy. So
wow.
you'd find them interesting, I
So,
think.
Mark, are they still applying any of that kind of thinking to, energy evaluations? Some net energy type?
Yeah, I mean, there's still people all over the world that are doing it. As a retiree, I just did one actually. I had a USDA NSF Nexus project, and we were looking at the U.S. seafood supply chain, and I did an energy evaluation of growing salmon, two different, well, one nature, that's the sockeye salmon in Alaska, and what's the total energy required to make a salmon, a kilogram of salmon that way, and then the way they make it salmon in Norway, which is it's incredibly industrialized, and what's the total energy to do it that way, as a comparative analysis. And the bottom line of it was there's not much difference between the two.
Wow.
Total
Huh.
energy, it takes about the same amount of energy to make a salmon nature does, or that the Norwegians do in an industrialized thing. Now, the quantities of the different forms of energy are quite different. It's all electricity in
Yeah.
Norway, and it's all ocean currents and rainfall and so forth in Alaska, but the quantity, the total quantity is about the same.
Oh.
But
Let
yeah,
me
it's
tell,
like,
I'd love to hear more about that kind of stuff. And,
okay.
and, here's another H.T Odum story. Um, when, when I had been up here a few years, the University of Maryland was one of the last of the universities in the coastal area to get it to become a Sea Grant college. And there were lots of, the big reason for that was that the internal fighting at College Park over who would run it was so severe that the federal people said, "Whoa, we'll wait till you sort that out before we're going to give you a penny." Anyway, eventually they got it sorted out, and Rita Caldwell, bobbed up to the surface of that. You may have heard of her,
Yeah.
Dave. I don't know,
Oh
but
yeah.
well, anyway, back in the day, we generally had this operational rule of that went like this: whatever you do, don't piss off Rita, because she didn't take prisoners. Anyway, she was head of Sea Grant, and Mike and I put in a pre-proposal, and the idea was to do an energetic analysis of several different types of oyster fishery in the bay, including the traditional historical skipjack fishery where they're under sail, catching oysters.
Right.
And so we put this pre-proposal together, set it up. Rita was the head of that program. She loved it. And so I'm thinking, holy, that's incredible. Boy, this would be really cool. So the whole proposal. And it turns out that the National Sea Grant Office was reviewing the Maryland program that year. They just do these kind of, I guess, federal reviews every few years. Anyway, so we got dragged up there. Mike and I got dragged up there for a day of meeting with this federal group. And so later in the day, it was my turn. I brought me up on the stage and I trot through this energy analysis of the oyster fishery. And, you could tell the audience was interested. Anyway, at the end of it, I asked for questions. And the guy who was the head of the Sea Grant Review Panel, whose name I can't remember, he raised his hand. And what he said was, H.T Odum can get away with this shit, but you can't.
No.
Yeah. Okay. You can see Rita dropping us like a hot potato.
Oh no.
Anyway, we didn't get funded.
Oh.
Yeah. Anyway, probably part of it was my own fault or our fault, just being overly, enthusiastic and promising the world,
Yeah.
as opposed to being, far more careful and cautious and blah, blah, blah. But that wasn't our style. Anyway,
Yeah.
that, yeah.
Well, HT used to say that, don't name things after him, don't use him, because there's a lot of people out there that have grudges and you get shot down for something if you have him as, name something or something from him. So he was very about that. Whenever I wrote a paper, I'd say, you ought to be on it. He says, well, if it'll help you, put me on it. If it won't help you, you don't have to put it on me. You don't have to put me on it.
We have a pretty controversial river keeper in our area. And so whenever I'm dealing with Fred and we're going somewhere, I said, Fred, are these people liable to hug you or hit you?
Black or white, no
Yeah,
gray area.
more than once he's been punched out.
Oh, really?
Yeah, oh yeah. Well, he can be pretty irritating.
Okay.
So,
Well, any final words? Any final words?
oh, I really appreciate you guys doing this. I mean, this was
It's
fun.
all
And
David, I think we were halfway through a bottle of wine when and I got this idea.
yeah, well, it's a good one. So who's next up on this?
Ariel, right?
Yeah,
Ariel.
Ariel's next week. We got Bill Mitch coming up in a few weeks.
Yeah.
Suzanne.
Oh,
Anybody you think that's we have our list, but maybe you could think of some
What
folks that we
about Jim Zucchetto?
Yeah, Jim,
Caddo.
I got it. He's on the list, but I've got to bring him up. You know, he needs to come up here soon.
He he taught my course when I went on sabbatical. He had just retired from the National Academies. I think
Oh,
that's the
right,
same year. So I had him teach my energy course.
right.
But that's been 4 or 5 years ago now, I guess. It was before COVID.
Yeah, right.
Uh,
Yeah.
I was thinking about that
Is,
earlier. There's a huge concentration of Odum students in Maryland. I mean, there's you and there's Pat and Jim. And then there's Dan Campbell. You know, Dan moved to Annapolis. He lives near Elliott in Annapolis.
oh, wow.
Um, so maybe we have our own little reunion, Maryland reunion.
You know,
Sure.
Elliot talked a little bit about that, but I never heard from him back on that. He said he was going to talk to his dad about
Uh-huh.
it. Anyway.
So Jim, who else are you thinking about? You could
What about, do you have any contact with Martha Gilliland?
we
No,
don't. We we would like to though. Her name has popped up, but we didn't know how to get in touch with her.
Yeah, I've not been in touch with her either.
Last I heard I think she had been the president at a
Yeah,
university in Missouri, right?
I think so. And I bet Bill Mitch would
Yeah,
have her contact.
you might.
Midwest
What about
connection.
Mel Lehman? Is he still around?
I don't have contact with him. I mean, if you've got
Yeah.
contact, have an email address for him, let me know.
You know, there was this fellow, Timmy Alstrom.
Tim also,
He
yeah,
did a master's degree. He was a Florida boy.
yeah.
And from our point of view, his claim to fame was that his folks were pretty well off relative to most of us. And in about 1973 or so, they bought him a $400 or $500 Texas Instrument calculator, engineering calculator, first one. And people like me changed our work habits so that you could I'd come in at like 10 or 11 at night when Timmy was done with it
Yeah.
and calculate coefficients all night long and not have to work with that damn slide rule. And that calculator changed my life.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway,
Wow, Tim Elstrom.
What about you talking about Wade Smith earlier? Is he still around?
the last I heard, Wade's health was really pretty bad, living in Northern Virginia. And he had worked his whole career for an engineering consulting firm there, the name of which escapes me right now.
Hmm.
I don't know if Wade has passed away or not.
Mm-hmm.
But it's been probably the last couple times I tried to contact him, I didn't get any answer.
Mm.
Mm.
Did you know this guy, Jerry Gears? He did his master's, not with Odom, but he took his class at Florida back in the early 70s. He's in the area. He's contacted me a couple of times. I don't know if you'd
Jerry
ever. Jerry
Gears.
Gears, like shifting gears.
Yeah,
He ended up working for Department of Energy, I think, most of his career. And he just
Huh.
lives up in Howard County in Columbia.
Wow.
Yeah.
the name's somewhat familiar, but I don't have a
Mark, I love this idea of the Energy Conference.
Yeah.
And Gainesville is changed enough so that I would not recognize it, I take it.
Even I
Yeah.
didn't recognize it. I was always gone for 10 years. So
Wow.
It's amazing, you know.
Well, you know, the county we live in is one of the smallest counties in Maryland. And in 1790, there were something like 14,000 people living in Calvert County. And in 1960, there were 19,000. So it had changed by a few thousand people over hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And when we moved here, that's what the population was in actually 1970, was 19,000. There were two stoplights in the county. It's 40 miles long and 10 miles wide. And one of the stoplights was right at the border of the county. So really there was only one stoplight. And the last 20 miles that Mary Ellen and I used to drive when we were coming back from DC, the last 20 miles from this little town of Prince Frederick to Solomon's Island we would always try to guess in the evening how many cars we would see. And the right answer was always 0 or 1.
Yeah.
And, yeah. And now there's 100,000 people that live here.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, you know, the days when on our little dead end road, you know, might come home and, you know, the wife of a tobacco farmer was sitting in your kitchen having coffee, you know, and that was, you know, and nobody would take the ignition keys out of the car because, well, somebody might need it for one thing, and secondly, you might lose them. Why would you take them out of the ignition? You know? Anyway, all of those kind of fanciful days are long gone.
Okay.
A lot of people here.
Definitely be invited to the next Energy Conference. So just, it's in January of 2025
All
here.
right, it's on my calendar also.
Okay, great.
Great. Well, Walt, it's been a pleasure.
Well,
And
yeah.
I knew you wouldn't disappoint. And
Oh, this
it's
has been
great.
great. It's
Yeah.
really good to see you guys. Really
you-
good.
You know, it's
Yeah.
been a long time, Walter. It's been a very long time.
Yeah.
All
All
right.
right.
listen,
Well, we'll go see you next year then. For
Yep,
sure.
stay good. Yeah,
All right.
and if a local conference is in the making, Dave, you know,
Yeah.
that would be fun.
I think it'd be
Yeah,
fun to try to get everybody, maybe get everybody together in like Annapolis or something. It's kind of
Well, you
central.
know, I get together with some of the oldsters at the Bay program about once a year. We have lunch at
Oh,
the Boatyard Cafe outdoors,
yeah.
and we lie at each other. It's a lot of fun.
That'd be good. I haven't even seen Elliot in a few years, so I need to catch up with him.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
see what you
let's
can
do
do.
that. Yeah. Okay. Great.
All right,
Should it?
peace.
Thanks. Have a
Yep,
good
see
one.
you guys.